Some people use money to own a room. Others walk in quietly and make the entire room forget who had the money. The velvet room glowed beneath amber chandeliers, and soft jazz like a memory Manhattan refused to let die. Crystal glasses clinked gently beneath clouds of low conversation while snow drifted past the tall windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. On nights like this, the city felt expensive just to breathe in. Clara Bennett moved silently between tables with a silver tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. Her black uniform pressed neatly despite the 12-hour shift already weighing on her shoulders. She carried herself differently from the other waitresses. Calmer, straighter, as if the noise of the room never quite reached her. Most customers barely noticed her beyond another polite smile and another refill of bourbon or sparkling water. Clara preferred it that way. Invisible people heard everything. "Table 7 wants another bottle," the bartender muttered while polishing a glass. Clara nodded softly and reached for the unopened bottle of Macallan 18 beside the register. The bartender watched her for a second before shaking his head with a quiet laugh. "You know who that is over there?" Clara glanced toward the private corner booth, surrounded by men in dark tailored suits and careless confidence. Ethan Blackwood sat at the center of the table, one arm draped lazily over the leather seat while his friends laughed too loudly at whatever he had just said. Even sitting still, he carried the kind of presence that bent rooms around him. Expensive watch, sharp jawline, cold gray eyes that looked permanently unimpressed. Clara recognized him immediately. Everyone in Manhattan did. Tech millionaire, investment genius, magazine covers, billion-dollar acquisitions. A man people described as brilliant right before calling him ruthless. "I know," Clara answered quietly. "Then good luck." The bartender smirked. "They've been drinking since 6. Clara approached the table calmly as a fresh wave of laughter erupted from Ethan's group. One of the men slapped the marble tabletop while another loosened his tie, already flushed from whiskey and victory. "There she is," someone said as Clara arrived beside them. "The only classy thing in this whole place." A few men chuckled. Clara kept her expression neutral. "Your bottle, gentlemen." Ethan barely looked up at first. He was studying numbers on his phone, the glow reflecting faintly across his face. "Leave it there," he said absently. His voice was smooth, controlled, used to obedience. Clara placed the bottle down carefully and began pouring into crystal tumblers. The jazz band near the stage shifted into a slow instrumental arrangement, soft trumpet echoing beneath the ceiling beams. Then Ethan finally looked up. His eyes landed on Clara for half a second longer than necessary. Something unreadable crossed his face. Not attraction exactly. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity that annoyed him. Clara reached for the final glass when one of Ethan's friends leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the small dance floor near the piano. "This place used to have dancers, didn't it?" "Years ago," another answered. "Back when Manhattan still knew how to entertain people." Ethan gave a faint, amused smile before taking a sip of whiskey. "Now everyone's afraid of offending somebody." More laughter followed. Clara turned to leave. Then the piano player shifted into the opening notes of Moonlight Serenade. The sound hit her like cold air. Her fingers tightened almost invisibly around the silver tray. One note, then another. Slow, familiar, dangerous. Ethan noticed the tiny pause immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Wait." Clara stopped politely. "Yes, sir?" Ethan leaned back comfortably, swirling amber liquid inside his glass while the room hummed softly around him. "Dance for us." The table exploded with laughter. One man even pulled a $100 bill from his wallet and tossed it casually onto the piano. "Come on," he grinned. "Give us a little show." Across the restaurant, conversations began fading. A few heads turned. Clara stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, her expression unreadable. Only her eyes changed, quietly, like something old had just opened behind them. Then her gaze drifted toward the stage, toward the piano, toward the song her father used to play on rainy nights before everything in her life fell apart. The laughter continued for another few seconds before slowly dissolving beneath the music. Clara remained motionless beside the table. The silver tray balanced carefully against her hip, while Moonlight Serenade drifted through the velvet room like smoke from another lifetime. Ethan studied her now with sharper attention. He had expected embarrassment, maybe irritation. Instead, the waitress looked strangely distant, as though the room around them had suddenly disappeared. One of his friends smirked and lifted his bourbon glass. "What is wrong?" he joked. "You forgot how to dance?" A few scattered chuckles followed, weaker this time. Clara lowered her eyes briefly toward the piano near the stage. The old pianist had stopped playing for half a breath after recognizing the expression on her face. He knew that look. The same look she carried every December when this song found its way into the room. "It is only a joke, sweetheart," another man added casually. "Nobody is asking for Broadway." Clara inhaled slowly, calmly. Then she set the tray down on the edge of a nearby table with careful precision. Several customers nearby stopped eating altogether. Something in the air had shifted. Even the waitstaff behind the bar began glancing toward the center of the room. Ethan leaned back against the leather booth, curiosity replacing amusement. "Well," he said smoothly, "are you going to ignore a customer request?" Clara finally looked directly at him. Her blue eyes were steady, quiet. "No, Mr. Blackwood," she answered softly. "I was just deciding whether the song deserved it." The comment landed differently than anyone expected. Not disrespectful, not flirtatious, just honest enough to remove the laughter from the table entirely. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted. "Interesting answer." Clara turned away before he could say another word and walked slowly toward the stage. The sound of her shoes crossing the polished wood floor echoed louder than it should have in the silence. Near the piano, the elderly musician watched her approach with visible disbelief. "Clara," he whispered carefully, "you do not have to do this." She gave him a small smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I know." The pianist glanced toward Ethan's table and frowned. "People like that do not understand certain things." Clara looked down at the faded silver watch wrapped delicately around her wrist. Her father's watch. The leather strap had cracked years ago, but she still wore it every night beneath her uniform sleeve. "No," she said quietly, "but my father loved this song too much for me to be afraid of it." The old musician exhaled slowly and adjusted his seat at the piano. Across the room, Ethan watched every movement now. Something about her composure unsettled him. Most people reacted to him instantly. They either tried to impress him or avoided disappointing him. Clara Bennett did neither. She moved through the room as though his money had no gravity at all. One of Ethan's friends leaned closer. "You think she is actually going to dance?" Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on Clara as she reached the center of the empty floor beneath the chandelier light. She removed her waitress apron carefully and folded it over the back of a chair. Simple gesture. Yet somehow the entire restaurant felt different afterward. Smaller, quieter. The band members exchanged uncertain glances, while customers slowly lowered their glasses onto white tablecloths. Even the bartenders stopped moving. Clara stepped onto the polished floor alone. One hand resting lightly against her side. Chin lifted slightly, graceful without trying to be. Then the piano began again. Soft, slow, familiar. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Blackwood stopped paying attention to himself. The first step was almost invisible. Clara moved slowly across the polished floor, one hand lifting gently into the amber light, while Moonlight Serenade wrapped itself around the room like velvet. No dramatic flourish, no attempt to impress. Yet something about the way she carried herself forced every eye toward her. The pianist softened his touch instinctively, allowing space for her movements to breathe between the notes. Clara closed her eyes for half a second. Then she began to dance. Not like someone performing for strangers, like someone remembering another life. Her steps were graceful without effort, each movement flowing naturally into the next as if the music already lived somewhere inside her bones. The restaurant had seen dancers before. Tourists, performers, influencers chasing applause and phone cameras. This was different. Clara danced like the room did not exist. Like the years between then and now had suddenly disappeared beneath her feet. Ethan felt himself leaning forward before realizing it. Around him, the laughter from his table had vanished completely. One of his friends slowly lowered the cigar he had been holding. Another stared openly, forgetting the whiskey in his hand altogether. Clara turned softly beneath the chandelier glow, her black uniform catching faint reflections from the crystal overhead. There was nothing provocative about the dance. Nothing loud. It was elegance stripped down to emotion alone. The kind of grace that made people quiet because they suddenly felt too clumsy to speak. An older couple near the window exchanged stunned glances. "Good Lord," the woman whispered softly. "Look at her posture." The man beside her nodded slowly. "That is not amateur training." Near the bar, one of the younger waitresses stood frozen with a tray in her hands. "Since when can Clara dance like that?" she murmured. The bartender did not answer. Even he looked unsettled now. Ethan's eyes never left Clara. He had spent years inside rooms filled with extraordinary people. Athletes, politicians, artists who charged millions for paintings he barely understood. Yet something about this woman standing alone beneath old jazz music felt impossible to categorize. She was not trying to take attention. That was what disturbed him most. Attention simply followed her naturally. Clara glided across the floor as the piano swelled deeper into the melody. For a brief moment, her expression softened completely, and suddenly she was no longer inside the velvet room. She was 17 again inside a small Brooklyn dance studio while rain tapped against fogged windows. Her father sat at the piano nearby wearing rolled sleeves and tired eyes, smiling every time she missed a step. "Again," he used to laugh softly. "You stop thinking too much, Clara. Music is not math. You do not control it. You trust it." Her chest tightened faintly at the memory, but her movements never broke. Back in the restaurant, the silence had become absolute. Even the kitchen doors had stopped swinging. Staff members quietly gathered near the back hallway just to watch. Then Ethan noticed something else. The old pianist was no longer leading the performance. He was following her. Every shift in rhythm, every pause, every breath. Clara controlled the room now without speaking a single word. Ethan felt an unfamiliar sensation settle heavily beneath his ribs. Shame, small at first, then sharper with every second she moved across the floor. Because suddenly he understood exactly what he had tried to reduce to entertainment. Not a waitress, not background noise. A woman carrying something rare enough to humble an entire room full of wealthy strangers. Clara finished a slow turn near the center of the floor just as the final chorus approached. Her eyes lifted briefly toward the chandelier light above her. Calm, distant, beautiful in the quietest possible way. Then a trembling voice near the back of the restaurant suddenly whispered, "Eleanor Bennett's daughter." Several heads turned instantly. An elderly woman standing beside the coat check stared at Clara with tears already forming in her eyes. "It cannot be," she breathed softly. "After all these years." Ethan's gaze sharpened immediately, because for the first time that night, he realized the waitress had walked into the room carrying a history far larger than anyone at his table. The final piano note lingered softly beneath the chandeliers before dissolving into complete silence. Clara stood motionless in the center of the dance floor, one hand resting lightly against her side, while her breathing remained calm and steady. For a long second, nobody moved. Then the elderly woman near the coat check took a trembling step forward. "I knew it," she whispered emotionally. "Those eyes. You are Eleanor Bennett's daughter." Murmurs spread instantly across the velvet room. Customers began turning toward one another with expressions of disbelief while Clara lowered her gaze briefly, almost as if she had hoped nobody would recognize her at all. The pianist removed his glasses slowly and shook his head with quiet admiration. "You dance exactly like your mother," he said softly. Clara gave a faint smile, sad this time. She would disagree. The older woman laughed through visible tears. "No, sweetheart. Eleanor used to float across a ballroom exactly like that. Ethan watched the exchange carefully, confusion mixing with growing fascination. "Who is Eleanor Bennett?" he finally asked. One of the older businessmen seated near the stage turned toward him immediately. "You seriously do not know?" Ethan remained silent. The man stared back in disbelief. 20 years ago, Eleanor Bennett was one of the most celebrated ballroom dancers in New York. Every gala wanted her. Every magazine wrote about her. Another guest nodded quietly. And her husband, Daniel Bennett, played piano at nearly every performance. People used to buy tickets months ahead just to watch them together. Ethan's eyes shifted slowly back toward Clara. Suddenly the grace, the composure, the impossible calm beneath pressure. It all made sense in a way that unsettled him deeply. Clara stepped away from the center of the floor, clearly intending to disappear quietly back into her shift before the attention could grow larger. But the older woman gently touched her arm. "Your mother would have been so proud tonight." Clara's expression flickered almost invisibly at the words. "Thank you, Mrs. Rosen." Ethan noticed the familiarity immediately. "You know her?" Mrs. Rosen looked toward him sharply. "I funded the Bennett Arts Foundation for years." Her eyes softened again as she looked back at Clara. "Your parents were extraordinary people." One of Ethan's friends shifted awkwardly beside him and cleared his throat. "So wait, why is she working here?" The question landed harder than intended. Clara's shoulders stiffened slightly. Mrs. Rosen's warm expression faded. "Because life is cruel sometimes," she answered quietly before Clara could speak. The room fell silent again. Ethan watched Clara carefully as she reached for her folded apron near the chair. There was no bitterness in her face, no embarrassment. That somehow made everything worse. "My father passed away when I was 19, Clara explained softly while tying the apron back around her waist. "My mother became sick not long after." Her fingers moved calmly, practiced from years of repeating the same motions night after night. Medical bills do not care about scholarships or dance trophies. Nobody at Ethan's table spoke now. The atmosphere had changed too completely. Even the men who had laughed the loudest earlier suddenly looked uncomfortable inside their expensive suits. Clara glanced politely toward the pianist. "Thank you for the music, Henry." The old man smiled gently. "Anytime, kid." Then she turned as though the entire moment had been nothing more than a short interruption to her shift. That was what stunned Ethan most. She was not waiting for praise, not enjoying the attention. If anything, she seemed eager to escape it. As Clara passed Ethan's table again, one of the men awkwardly reached for his wallet and pulled out several $100 bills. "Hey!" he muttered uncomfortably. "That was incredible. At least let us tip you properly." Clara stopped briefly beside the table. Her blue eyes moved from the money to Ethan, then back again. "Keep it," she said softly. The dance was never for sale. The words landed harder than any public humiliation Ethan had ever experienced. Because she did not say them with anger. She said them with dignity. Quiet, certain, final. Clara picked up her silver tray again and walked calmly toward another table waiting for service near the windows, leaving behind a room full of wealthy strangers suddenly unsure of what their money was worth anymore. And for the first time in years, Ethan Blackwood felt genuinely ashamed of the person he had become. The velvet room slowly returned to motion, but nothing felt the same anymore. Conversations resumed in softer voices. Glasses clinked more carefully. Even the waitstaff moved differently, as if everyone had collectively realized they had witnessed something too personal to discuss loudly. Clara carried a tray of drinks toward a table near the windows while snow continued drifting outside Manhattan in slow white spirals. Her expression had returned to calm professionalism, but her hands felt colder now. Dancing again had opened doors inside her she usually kept locked. Doors filled with piano music and hospital hallways and memories she could not afford during double shifts and overdue bills. "Miss Bennett." Clara looked up. Ethan Blackwood stood beside the service station alone now, his expensive suit jacket folded neatly over one arm. Without his friends surrounding him, he looked strangely different, less untouchable somehow. Clara kept her voice polite. "Can I help you, Mr. Blackwood?" Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second. Tiny pause, but noticeable. Men like him were not used to uncertainty. "I owe you an apology." Clara said nothing. Ethan glanced briefly toward the nearly empty dance floor before continuing. "What I said earlier was disrespectful." His voice remained calm, but quieter than before. "And the truth is, I think I knew it the second it left my mouth." Clara studied him carefully. Most wealthy men apologized the way corporations released public statements. Smooth words designed to restore comfort. This felt different, not polished enough. "People usually mean exactly what they say the first time," Clara answered softly. Ethan absorbed the comment without reacting defensively. That surprised her more than the apology itself. Behind them, the pianist Henry closed the lid of the piano slowly while preparing for the band's short break. The old musician watched Ethan carefully, protective without saying a word. "You embarrassed yourself," Clara continued quietly while adjusting the glasses on her tray. "But I do not think you are cruel." Ethan gave a faint, humorless laugh. "That might be generous." Clara shook her head lightly. "Cruel people do not look ashamed afterward." For the first time that evening, Ethan did not have an answer ready. He simply looked at her. Really looked at her. The exhaustion hidden beneath the elegance. The faint crease near her wrist from wearing the old watch too tightly. The careful calm of someone who had spent years surviving disappointment without allowing it to harden her completely. "You should not be working here," he said finally. Clara almost smiled at that. "You sound exactly like everyone else who thinks talent automatically protects people from real life." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. "Fair point." Nearby, a young busboy accidentally dropped a stack of silverware onto the marble counter with a loud crash. The teenager froze immediately, face pale with panic. "I am sorry," he stammered nervously toward the restaurant manager approaching from the hallway. "I did not mean to." "Do you know how expensive this place is?" The manager snapped sharply. "Maybe if you spent less time staring at customers and more time doing your job." Clara stepped forward instantly before the boy could answer. "It was my fault." Both the manager and busboy looked at her in surprise. Clara remained calm. "I asked him to help me carry trays too quickly." The manager sighed in annoyance. "Fine, just clean it up." He walked away muttering under his breath while the young employee stared at Clara in disbelief. "But it was not your fault," the teenager whispered once the manager disappeared. Clara handed him a folded napkin with a small reassuring smile. "Everyone deserves one graceful exit per shift." The boy laughed nervously before kneeling to gather the silverware. Ethan watched the entire interaction silently. Something inside him shifted again. Because Clara had not stepped in to impress anyone. She had done it instinctively. Quiet kindness. Immediate. Uncalculated. The kind people rarely performed when no advantage existed. Clara turned back toward Ethan. "Was there anything else, Mr. Blackwood?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Actually, yes." His voice lowered slightly. "Would you sit with me for 5 minutes after your shift ends?" Clara blinked once, clearly caught off guard. Ethan immediately added, "Not as entertainment. Not because I think money buys conversations." He exhaled slowly. "I just realized tonight that I spend most of my life surrounded by people who clap when I speak. And I think you might be the first person in years who was not impressed by me at all." Clara's eyes softened almost invisibly at the honesty in his voice. Then she glanced toward the windows where snow continued falling softly against the city lights. "Maybe," she said quietly, "because I know what applause sounds like when it is real." Clara did not answer immediately. The restaurant had thinned considerably over the last hour, leaving behind only the kind of Manhattan customers who treated midnight like an extension of their importance. Outside the tall windows, snow coated the sidewalks in silver, while yellow taxi lights drifted slowly through the storm like distant lanterns. Ethan waited quietly beside the service station, something he probably had not done for anyone in years. Clara noticed that too. Wealthy men usually filled silence because silence made them uncomfortable. Ethan simply stood there, hands resting loosely in his pockets, watching her with unusual patience. 5 minutes, Clara said finally. After closing. Ethan nodded once. That is fair. Then he stepped back without trying to extend the conversation further. Again, unexpected. Clara picked up another tray and continued working through the final stretch of the evening, while the velvet room slowly settled into its softer late-night rhythm. Henry returned briefly to the piano, playing quieter standards now, melodies gentle enough to blend into the snowfall outside. Several customers stopped Clara during the next hour. Some complimented her dancing politely. Others asked questions about her parents or old performances they remembered from decades earlier. Clara answered kindly but briefly each time. She had learned long ago that nostalgia could become exhausting when people loved the memory of your family more than the reality of your life. Near 1 o'clock, the final guests began leaving beneath heavy winter coats and soft thank yous to the staff. Ethan remained seated alone at table 7 with a half-finished glass of whiskey untouched beside him. He had not checked his phone once in nearly 40 minutes. That alone felt shocking. Clara noticed it while wiping down nearby tables. "You are still here," Henry muttered quietly while stacking sheet music near the piano. Ethan glanced over with a faint smile. Apparently, the old musician studied him carefully. Most rich men lose interest once the mystery disappears. Ethan looked toward Clara folding napkins near the bar. "I do not think the mystery disappeared at all." Henry chuckled softly beneath his breath. "Careful, son. Women like Clara do not fall for expensive watches and rehearsed charm." Ethan's eyes drifted briefly toward the old silver watch hidden beneath Clara's sleeve. "That is becoming very clear." By 1:30, the velvet room officially closed. Chairs turned upside down onto polished tables while the cleaning crew moved quietly through the dining room. Clara untied her apron slowly near the back hallway and slipped on her dark wool coat. The exhaustion in her shoulders became more visible now that customers were gone. Ethan stood as she approached table 7. "Thank you for waiting," she said politely. "Thank you for not leaving," he answered. Clara sat carefully across from him while snow continued falling outside the windows. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them felt strangely comfortable. Ethan finally leaned back slightly in his chair. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Clara nodded once. "Why did you stay?" Ethan looked genuinely confused. "Stay where?" "In New York. In restaurants. In this life." Her blue eyes remained calm. "Most people who lose careers like yours disappear somewhere quieter." Ethan looked down briefly at the untouched whiskey glass. "Because leaving would feel like admitting I built my entire life around the wrong things." Clara studied him carefully now. "That is an unusually self-aware answer for a billionaire." Ethan laughed softly for the first time all night. Real laugh this time. Tired. Human. "My father used to say money only makes people louder versions of themselves." Clara tilted her head slightly. "And what did it make you?" Ethan stared toward the empty dance floor for several seconds before answering. "Someone impressive at dinner parties." The honesty caught her off guard again. He did not say it dramatically. No self-pity. Just truth stripped clean of performance. Clara rested her hands quietly around a warm coffee cup left behind by the bartender. "That sounds lonely." Ethan met her eyes. "It is." Snow drifted heavier against the windows now, softening the city outside into blurred lights and silence. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clattered faintly while Henry played one final melody beneath his breath at the piano. Clara watched Ethan carefully across the table. For the first time that evening, he no longer looked like a millionaire sitting inside a luxury restaurant. He looked like a man exhausted from pretending he had everything. The city had grown quieter by the time they stepped outside the velvet room together. Snow covered the sidewalks in soft layers that reflected the glow of Manhattan streetlights, turning the avenue into a watercolor of gold and white. Clara pulled her wool coat tighter against the cold while Ethan held the restaurant door open behind her. The sharp winter air carried the distant sound of taxis and muted jazz drifting faintly from somewhere down the block. For a few seconds, they simply stood beneath the awning watching snowflakes spiral through the light. "I forgot New York could look peaceful," Ethan admitted quietly. Clara glanced toward him. It only looks peaceful after midnight. Before that, everyone is too busy trying to prove something. Ethan smiled faintly at the observation. You always talk like that? Like what? Like someone who notices things everyone else misses. Clara looked ahead toward the empty street. Maybe because I spent years being ignored. The words were simple, calm, yet they stayed with Ethan longer than he expected. His driver slowly pulled a black town car toward the curb, tires crunching softly through fresh snow. The moment the car stopped, the illusion of normalcy threatened to return. Wealth, status, distance. Ethan noticed Clara subtly step backward the second she saw the vehicle. Not intimidated, just careful, as if she had learned expensive things always came with conditions. Ethan surprised himself by turning toward the driver immediately. Go home, Richard. The driver blinked in confusion. Sir, I said go home. But the storm. I will manage. Richard hesitated briefly before nodding and driving away into the snowy avenue. Clara watched the taillights disappear. You did not have to do that. Ethan slid his hands into his coat pockets. Yes, I did. Snow gathered lightly across his dark hair now, softening the sharpness of his appearance. For the first time that night, he looked less like the man from magazine covers and more like someone tired of being recognized everywhere he went. Clara began walking slowly toward the subway entrance 3 blocks away. Ethan matched her pace without asking permission. So, he said carefully, what happened after your mother got sick? Clara exhaled softly into the cold air. Hospitals, bills, long nights. Her voice remained steady, but quieter now. By 22, I was working 2 jobs and selling most of what my parents left behind. Ethan glanced toward her wrist where the old silver watch remained hidden beneath her sleeve. Not everything. Clara touched the watch unconsciously. No, my father bought this after his first sold-out performance. A faint smile crossed her face. He said time mattered more when dreams finally started coming true. They walked another half-block in silence. Snow crunched beneath their shoes while storefront lights reflected across the icy pavement. Ethan looked at her carefully. Do you miss dancing? Clara did not answer right away. Instead, she stopped briefly beside a darkened shop window glowing faintly with Christmas lights inside. Her reflection stared back at her. Older now, tired around the eyes, still carrying traces of the girl who once believed applause could build a future. Every day, she admitted softly, but eventually survival becomes louder than dreams. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest at the honesty of that sentence, because he suddenly realized he had spent years chasing success while this woman had spent years sacrificing herself quietly just to keep moving forward. You know what is strange? Clara asked suddenly as they resumed walking. Tonight, everyone looked at me like I became important for 5 minutes. Ethan frowned slightly. You were important long before tonight. Clara shook her head gently. No. Tonight they respected me because they discovered I used to be extraordinary. Her eyes drifted toward the snowy street ahead. Very few people know how to respect ordinary kindness. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar deals without losing composure. He had faced investors, hostile boards, politicians, reporters. Yet nothing anyone had ever said to him felt as quietly devastating as that sentence. Because deep down he knew she was right. They reached the subway entrance just as cold wind rushed upward from underground tunnels. Clara stopped near the stairwell railing and looked toward him with calm blue eyes softened by exhaustion. Thank you for walking with me. Ethan stared at her for a moment longer than necessary. Snow settled silently onto the shoulders of her dark coat while the city moved around them without noticing. Clara, he said quietly, I think tonight may have been the first honest conversation I have had in years. She studied him carefully before answering. Then maybe, she said softly, you should stop surrounding yourself with people who clap every time you speak. Clara descended halfway toward the subway platform before stopping unexpectedly. The warm underground air rushed upward through the station while distant train brakes echoed beneath the city. She looked back once toward Ethan standing near the entrance above. Snow drifted behind him beneath the streetlights, catching against the dark fabric of his coat. For reasons she could not fully explain, leaving felt strangely difficult. Ethan noticed her hesitation immediately. "What is it?" Clara gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "Nothing." He waited quietly. Clara sighed softly. "It is just strange." "What is?" She glanced toward the empty subway stairs around them. "Most people spend one conversation trying to impress you." Ethan looked genuinely amused by that. "And you think you are not?" Clara laughed under her breath. Soft sound. "Real. Mr. Blackwood. I spent half the night telling you uncomfortable truths." "Ethan," he corrected gently. "You can call me Ethan." Clara studied him for a second before nodding once. "Fine, Ethan." Hearing his name in her voice affected him more than it should have. There was no greed in it, no performance, just simplicity, human and unguarded. Clara finally stepped back up from the subway entrance slowly. "I do not actually want to go underground right now." Ethan glanced toward the heavy snowfall coating Lexington Avenue. "Understandable. The trains smell terrible after midnight." He smiled faintly. "That might be the most normal thing anyone has said to me in months." They began walking again without deciding on a direction. Manhattan stretched around them quieter now, wrapped in snow and muted traffic lights. A street vendor nearby was closing his cart for the night, steam rising from metal trays into the cold air. Clara stopped briefly at the scent of roasted chestnuts drifting through the sidewalk. Ethan noticed immediately. "Hungry?" Clara shook her head automatically. "I am fine." Ethan looked toward the nearly empty food cart. That was a very unconvincing answer. Before she could object, he walked over and purchased 2 small paper bags from the vendor. Clara frowned as he returned. "You really do use money to solve everything." "No," Ethan answered calmly, handing her 1 warm bag. "I use chestnuts to solve hunger." Clara laughed again despite herself. The sound surprised both of them. She accepted the bag quietly, warming her cold hands against it while they continued walking beneath the snow. For a few minutes neither spoke. They simply moved through the sleeping city side by side, while steam curled upward from street grates and taxi headlights reflected across icy pavement. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said eventually. Clara nodded while peeling a chestnut slowly. "When you danced tonight," he hesitated carefully, "were you angry at me?" Clara considered the question longer than he expected. "At first," she admitted softly. "A little." Ethan nodded once, accepting it. "Fair." But then the music started. She looked ahead toward the glowing skyline in the distance. "And suddenly it stopped being about you." Ethan felt those words settle heavily inside him, because that was exactly what had happened. Somewhere between the piano notes and the silence in the room, his ego had disappeared from the center of the story completely. Clara had not danced to defeat him. She had danced because the song mattered more than humiliation. "You know," Ethan said quietly, "most people would have taken revenge." Clara's expression softened beneath the streetlights. "Revenge keeps you connected to the person who hurt you." Snow landed gently in her hair while she spoke. "My father used to say dignity means deciding who controls your spirit." Ethan stared at her in silence afterward. He had spent years mastering negotiations, public speaking, business strategy. Yet this waitress walking beside him through a snowstorm carried more emotional clarity than most executives he had ever met. They reached Bryant Park just as fresh snow blanketed the empty tables and frozen lawn in white. Clara slowed near the iron fence surrounding the skating rink, now nearly deserted except for maintenance workers in the distance. "My parents used to bring me here after performances," she said quietly. Ethan stood beside her, listening. "My mother loved winter because she said snow forced New Yorkers to slow down long enough to remember they were human." Clara smiled faintly at the memory. Then her expression changed almost imperceptibly as she noticed someone sitting alone near the far bench beneath a flickering lamp. An elderly man wrapped in a thin coat sat shivering quietly beside a small paper cup of untouched coffee. Without hesitation, Clara walked toward him. The elderly man looked up in surprise as Clara approached the bench through the falling snow. His hands trembled slightly around the paper coffee cup while cold wind curled through Bryant Park in soft, bitter waves. Clara crouched beside him without hesitation, the hem of her dark coat brushing lightly against the snow-covered pavement. "Sir," she said gently, "you are freezing." The man attempted a weak smile. "Been colder winters." Clara glanced at the thin coat hanging loosely from his shoulders and knew immediately he was lying. Ethan stopped several feet away, watching quietly while snow settled across the park around them. Clara removed her wool scarf carefully and wrapped it around the man's neck before he could protest. "You keep that," she said softly. "Miss, I cannot take your scarf." "Sure you can." Her voice carried the same calm certainty Ethan had noticed all evening. "I look terrible in this color anyway." The old man laughed weakly beneath the scarf while Clara opened the paper bag of warm chestnuts Ethan had bought earlier. She placed it carefully into the man's hands. "These will help a little." Ethan stared at her silently. Most people walked past suffering because they convinced themselves someone else would help eventually. Clara stopped automatically. No audience, no applause, just kindness moving faster than hesitation. The elderly man looked between Clara and Ethan with tired eyes. "You two married?" Clara blinked in surprise while Ethan nearly laughed. "No," Clara answered quickly. "We just met." The man nodded slowly as if unconvinced. "Well, you look at each other like people who still believe good things are possible." For a moment neither Clara nor Ethan spoke. Snow drifted softly between them while the city lights glowed against the white-covered park. Clara touched the old man's shoulder gently before standing again. "There is a church shelter 3 blocks west," she told him quietly. "They stay open during storms." The man nodded gratefully. "Thank you, sweetheart." Clara smiled softly. "Stay warm." They walked away slowly beneath the falling snow while Ethan remained unusually quiet beside her. Finally, he looked toward her with something close to disbelief. "Do you always do that?" Clara frowned slightly. "Do what?" "Give parts of yourself away to strangers like it is nothing." Clara looked down briefly at her now empty hands. "It was only a scarf." "No," Ethan said quietly. "It was not." They continued walking through Bryant Park while distant traffic hummed softly beyond the snow-covered trees. Clara tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear against the cold wind. "When my mother got sick," she said after a long silence, "people helped us constantly." Ethan listened carefully. Neighbors brought groceries. A pharmacist covered medication costs for 3 months without telling anyone. One waitress at a diner in Queens used to pack extra soup into my bag every night after shifts. Clara smiled faintly at the memory. Most of those people had far less money than the customers at the Velvet Room. Ethan felt the truth in her words settle deeply inside him, because he suddenly realized his world had taught people to admire generosity only when it came from wealth. Clara admired it when it came from sacrifice. They stopped beneath the lights near the skating rink where snowflakes spun slowly through the air like drifting ash. Ethan looked at her carefully. "You know what is terrifying?" Clara glanced toward him. "What?" He exhaled slowly. "Tonight I realized I have spent years building a life people envy." His eyes lowered briefly toward the frozen park around them. "And somehow you are happier carrying chestnuts through a snowstorm than most people I know sitting inside penthouses." Clara studied him quietly before answering. "That is because peace and luxury are not the same thing." Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her. The tired waitress standing in borrowed winter boots with snow melting into her hair had somehow dismantled years of arrogance without humiliating him once. She had done it through honesty, through grace, through small acts nobody else considered important enough to notice. Somewhere behind them, church bells echoed softly through the snowy Manhattan night. Clara smiled faintly and stepped backward toward the subway entrance again. "Good night, Ethan." He opened his mouth slightly as if to stop her, then paused. Because for once in his life, he understood some moments became meaningful precisely because you did not try to own them. Ethan watched Clara disappear slowly down the subway stairs until the city swallowed her completely. Snow continued falling across Bryant Park while distant piano music drifted faintly from somewhere uptown. And standing there alone beneath the winter lights, Ethan Blackwood finally understood something money had never been able to teach him. The most powerful person in a room is rarely the loudest one. Usually, it is the quiet person who reminds everyone else how to be human again.